Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. 50 years ago, a huge group of people at NASA pulled off one of the world's greatest engineering accomplishments and took us to the moon. But times have changed at NASA, and now they're largely focused on climate. And a lot of the people with the right stuff who took us to the moon are unhappy about what's going on at the agency. 9 years ago, a group of former NASA engineers, scientists, and astronauts wrote a letter to the NASA administrator, Charles Bolden Jr., blasting the agency for making unwarranted claims about the role of carbon dioxide in global warming. They wrote, "We believe the claims by NASA and JIST, NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, that man-made carbon dioxide is having a catastrophic impact on global climate change are not substantiated, especially when considering thousands of years of empirical data." This is the same position which I've been presenting for the past 13 years, and it's good to know that the people who took us to the moon agree with me. So now we're going to take a look at some of the ways which NASA has been rewriting the global temperature record. George Orwell in his novel 1984 wrote, "If all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past." This graph used to be prominently featured on the NASA website. The graph purports to show how global temperatures over land have risen over the past 140 years. The graph shows a fairly steady rise from 1880 to 1980, and then a sharp break in slope when temperatures started rising much faster. This graph is still on the NASA web server, but as far as I can tell is no longer linked from any other pages. It's been replaced by another graph which should show exactly the same thing. The new graph shows what NASA says are land temperatures in red and what they claim are ocean temperatures in blue. The new graph shows about 2.1 degrees Celsius of warming over land since the year 1880. But the other version of the same graph only shows about 1.7 degrees warming over the same time period. I'm going to flash back and forth a few times between the two different versions of the graph so you can see how the data has been changed. This is version 1. Version 2, a lot more warming. Version 1 had a lot less warming. Version 2 has a lot more warming. So what's going on here? Both graphs are just land temperatures V4. Climate skeptic Tom Nelson forwarded my graph to the person in charge at NASA, Gavin Schmidt, and asked him what his thoughts were. And this is how Gavin Schmidt responded to being caught red-handed tampering with data. He posted a little icon of a clown and a red car. I don't have any doubt that Gavin Schmidt is running a clown show at NASA, so his response was actually fairly appropriate. Gavin doesn't like the fact that I've been calling out his malfeasance for the past 13 years, so he has me blocked on Twitter, but he does have a very colorful mask. But I'm just getting started with this story of data tampering. Let's go back now to 1974 and look at this graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. The graph showed that 1970 was actually a little bit cooler than 1870. It showed a lot of warming from about 1890 up to 1940, followed by a sharp cooling which erased all of the prior warming. Des Moines Sunday Register, July 21, 1974. World is getting cooler. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people considered these weather conditions to be abnormal and temporary, but instead climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with unusually mild weather and that the global climate has begun returning to a harsher but more normal state. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. The average temperature of the world as a whole has dropped by 1/3 to 1/2 a degree centigrade in the last 30 years. The decline of prevailing temperatures since about 1945 appears to be the longest continued downward trend since temperature records began, says Professor Hubert H. Lamb of the University of East Anglia in Britain. Global cooling may be the cause of the devastating African drought now in its 6th year. Some scientists believe that expansion of the cold polar air caps pushed the monsoon rain belt southward, causing many of the life-giving rains to fall on already fertile lands or into the sea. Dry weather conditions also prevail in parts of India, China, Kenya, Bolivia, and other countries on both sides of the equator, raising the specter of even more serious drought and famine. So everything which climatologists now blame on global warming, 45 years ago they blamed the same things on global cooling. Now let's look at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's magazine for October 1974. They said annual average temperatures over the northern hemisphere increased rather dramatically from about 1890 through 1940, but have been falling ever since. The total changes averaged about 1/2 degrees centigrade, with the greatest cooling in higher latitudes. A drop of only 1 or 2 degrees centigrade in the annual average temperature at higher latitudes can shorten the growing season so that some crops have to be abandoned. There's reason to believe, for example, that rice was once grown far north of its present boundary in parts of Asia. According to British meteorologist Hubert Lamb, the average growing season in England is already 2 weeks shorter than it was before 1950. Since the late 1950s, Iceland's hay crop yield has dropped about 25%, while pack ice in waters around Iceland and Greenland ports is becoming the hazard to navigation it was during the 17th and 18th centuries. At lower latitudes, as in the Sahel, the amount of precipitation available during certain phases of the growing season is critical to food production. That kind of climatic variation now in progress includes changes in the tracks of precipitation-producing storms through major grain-producing regions. In India, for example, before the global warming trend of 1890 to 1940, severe drought struck about once every 4 years. With the warming, however, and more abundant monsoon rains, drought only came once every 18 years or so, greatly increasing India's grain production. Some climatologists think that if the current cooling trend continues, drought will occur more frequently in India, indeed through much of Asia, the world's hungriest continent. From 1890 through 1940, man enjoyed the warmest climate the world had known for 5 or 6 centuries. So in 1974, there was no question in the scientific community that the world had been cooling since the 1940s, and that warm temperatures were a good thing. Scientists understood that cooler temperatures meant drought and extreme weather. The ice in the waters around Iceland and Greenland during the 1970s was the worst it had been since the 17th and 18th centuries. Arctic sea ice extent was very high during the 1970s, which is why government agencies start their sea ice graphs in 1979. The time around 1979 and 1980 had the most Arctic sea ice of the last century, so by cherry-picking a start date of 1979, they can make it look like the Earth is burning up and the ice is all going to disappear. The standard excuse used by climate alarmists for starting sea ice graphs in 1979 is that we didn't have satellite data prior to 1979, but that simply isn't true. The 1990 United Nations IPCC report showed that we had satellite sea ice data going back to the early 1970s, and that there was a large increase in the amount of sea ice during the 1970s. But by starting their graphs in 1979 and hiding all the prior data, climate alarmists have been able to make it appear like there's been a steady decline in sea ice, when actually the trend is cyclical rather than linear. But that's a different story which I'll cover in a different video. In 1978, the New York Times said, "International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere." 1978 was actually right at the end of the 30-year cooling trend, which made 1979 a fantastic year for propagandists to start their sea ice graphs. But NASA has made this 30-year cooling trend almost completely disappear. In this chart, I've overlaid the first version of the NASA V4 land temperatures in red on top of the NCAR graph from 1974. As you can see, NASA has erased the sharp cooling which occurred after the 1940s. The disappearance of this cooling didn't happen by accident, as shown in this ClimateGate email from 2009. From Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, copying Ben Santer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. The email was discussing what they called the 1940s warming blip. Tom Wigley wrote, "So if we could reduce the ocean blip by say 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we'd still have to explain the land blip. It'd be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So they wanted to get rid of the 1940s warmth and subsequent cooling and didn't even have an explanation for why they were doing it. And that's exactly what they did. These people aren't doing science, they're committing blatant, transparent political fraud. Let's go back now further into NASA temperature graph history. These graphs from NASA were from 1981 and still showed somewhat of a 1940s blip and subsequent cooling, though quite a bit smaller than what was seen in the 1974 NCAR graph. In 1981, NASA not only showed a 1940s warming blip, but they also showed a medieval warm period around the year 1200 and a Holocene optimum around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Both of these have been erased as well, along with the 1940s blip. NASA and their friends have been hard at work rewriting the Earth's history over the past 40 years. The medieval warm period has now been completely erased by the climate science community, as has the 1940 to 1970 cooling. One of the most famous ClimateGate emails discussed how Michael Mann had hidden the decline in temperatures after the 1940s by erasing inconvenient proxy data. Tree ring data showed that temperatures cooled sharply after the 1940s into the 1970s, so Michael Mann simply erased the data shown in red. And he replaced the tree ring data with the fake temperature data, which I'm discussing in this video. This chart shows the NASA 1981 data in black and the current NASA data in red. As of 1981, there was still cooling after the 1940s, but almost all of that has been disappeared since. The baseline period of the 1981 graph and the 2021 graph may not be identical, so the thing to focus on is the shape of the graphs rather than their absolute position. Now let's look at another very important history rewrite which was done by NASA over the last 20 years. This was the NASA global temperature anomaly data from the year 2000, which at that time went back to the 1860s. The 2000 version of NASA global temperature showed no net warming from the 1870s through the 1970s. And they show that the warmest year from the 1860s through 1979 was 1878, which was a very important year. I'm going to be discussing the very hot year of 1878 in a minute, but first let's look at the current version of NASA global temperatures. NASA now hides all the temperatures prior to 1880 and shows a very strong warming trend from the 1870s through the 1970s. So now NASA shows a strong warming trend prior to 1980, but 20 years ago they showed no warming at all during that period. 20 years ago NASA showed a century of no warming, and now they show very strong warming. They've completely rewritten Earth's history. Now let's look at the very hot year of 1878 and discuss something else which NASA and their friends in academia are trying to hide. This is a graph of the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, which is a very important ocean circulation pattern which largely controls Earth's temperatures. 1878 was the peak year of the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. That brought very high temperatures and a lot of extreme weather. When the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation is in its warm phase, it brings warm temperatures to Earth, like in the 1870s, around 1940, and in recent decades. Meanwhile, the coldest phase of the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation occurred during the 1970s. And if you remember from the 1974 NOAA report, seaports in Iceland and Greenland were blocked with ice for the first time since the 18th century. The 1970s was the coldest period on record for the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. But that'll have to be the topic of a different video. Let's look at the record high year of 1878. In March of 1878, the Minneapolis Tribune reported that there was no winter in Minnesota that year. Winters in Minnesota now are extremely cold, but in 1878 they had no winter at all. At the same time in Australia, they were having record heat. Burke, New South Wales, west of Sydney, reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, which is their all-time record high temperature. It was reached only once again in 1906. There was a worldwide drought in 1877 and 1878, which produced massive famines in China and India. The 1878 drought also hit New Zealand and Tasmania. It's quite a new thing to hear of want of rain in New Zealand and Tasmania, but from both these colonies complaints have come continuously during the last 3 or 4 months of desiccated pastures and ruined crops. The famine of 1877 and 1878 in China killed nearly 10 million people. The world population in 1878 was much smaller than it is now, and to put that number in perspective, the official statistics for COVID-19 deaths are about 3 million worldwide. On January 29, 1878, the Sydney Morning Herald reported, "The drought which has prevailed for many months in almost every portion of the southern hemisphere and also in large continental tracts north of the equator is so general in its character and has been productive of such disastrous results that it may be regarded as one of the most remarkable and calamitous visitations of modern times." On January 24, 1878, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that the present drought had extended over a great portion of the globe, including India, China, and South America. On March 2, 1878, it was reported that there was a very serious drought in South Africa. On June 7, 1878, it was reported that nearly 1 3/4 million sheep had died in Australia from the drought. In 1877, it was reported, in 1876 the drought was very general. In northern New Jersey, vegetation burned up, meadows were destroyed, potatoes and corn did not grow at all, streams ran dry, and wells gave out. This was from the New York Sun. The peak year of the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation was 1878. That year and the years around it were very hot and dry. The historical record shows this quite clearly. The historical record is very embarrassing to climate scientists and shows that they have no clue what they're talking about, which is why Michael Mann, who's already erased the medieval warm period, is now attempting to erase the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation as well. The 1870s brought some extremely brutal weather, including the most disastrous fires in U.S. history. 150 years ago, on October 7, 1871, the New York Times reported, "Prairies in flames, 150 miles swept by fire, men, women, and children fleeing for their lives, immense loss of property of all kinds," from the St. Paul, Minnesota Pioneer, October 3rd. So in 1871, much of Minnesota burned, and in 1878, Minnesota didn't have a winter. This is quite remarkable weather. On October 7, 1871, the Chicago Tribune reported, "In the Minnesota forests, the great fire is still raging with unabated fury." And the following day, on October 8, 1871, Chicago burned to the ground. The Great Chicago Fire of October 8, 1871 was very widely reported by the press, but it wasn't the worst fire going on that day. Here's a report from the Daily Telegraph, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, October 14, 1871. "The Great Western Fires, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota still on fire. The Rocky Mountains in flames." But the worst fires occurred in Wisconsin, described as the Wisconsin Calamity. A huge area around Green Bay, Wisconsin burned on October 8, 1871, with the worst destruction at Peshtigo. More than 1,000 people died in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, in a firestorm which came up completely without warning just as people were leaving church. Climate propagandists want people to believe that the climate was stable when CO2 levels were lower, but that's absolutely not true. And the belief that we can improve the weather by lowering CO2 levels has no basis in science or history. The weather in the past was often horrific, and it was controlled by the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, not carbon dioxide. This is one of my favorite articles, which is also from 1871, Imaginary Changes of Climate. Brisbane Courier via the Pall Mall Gazette. 3 consecutive years of drought, while they've stimulated the inventive resources of practical agriculturalists, have had the natural effect of calling forth a plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, in all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. We've often noticed that in the tabular statements of those compilers of weather records who write to the Times, useful and welcome as their communications are, every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. Reality is that climate change superstition has plagued humanity for as long as humans have been observing the weather. And the current superstition is even worse because many humans now believe that government controls the climate. King Canute had the same problem 1,000 years ago. His subjects believed that government could control sea level just as many Democrats believe now. So King Canute took his subjects down to the sea and made a command to the seas. Of course the seas didn't obey, and then his subjects understood that he didn't actually control sea level. But unfortunately for us, King Canute was much smarter than Joe Biden. Government not only can't control climate, but they also can't control the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Over the past 30 years, we've had dozens of climate agreements, and even the recent lockdown had no impact on the growth of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. We keep hearing politicians in the press talking about something called climate policy, but the idea that government can control the climate via policy is based on superstition. The historical record provides no evidence that government can either control the climate or prevent extreme weather. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this widespread superstition for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.